Now, as the world marked International Women's Day on March 8th, the UN released a report showing some of the progress that's been made when it comes to gender equality in the realm of education. It notably found that globally there are now fewer girls out of school than boys. While overall the situation is improving for women's education, there remain pockets of exclusion, notably in Afghanistan and parts of Africa. For more on the report's findings, we can speak now to its director, Manos Antoninis. Thank you so much for joining us here on France 24 today. Let's start with the positive findings from this report. How has girls' access to education changed in recent years, and what led to that change?
Progress in girls' education has been taking on for quite some time. It's a trend that we started observing at the beginning of the century. Already by 2010, there was parity achieved in primary and secondary education. But one has to look at this situation in its nuanced version because there are so many different dimensions. As you said, there are now still pockets of exclusion of girls in many parts of Africa, mainly Western Africa, like you saw Nigeria earlier in the story. And there the problems remain: discrimination, lack of belief in the girls' potential, despite efforts that have been taking place over many years.
And can you talk a little bit about those areas where we're not seeing progress? Afghanistan, for instance, parts of Africa. What's being done to create progress in those areas?
So let me give you one example. There are countries like Guinea, for instance, where the poorest girls are as much excluded from education as girls in Afghanistan. And there are so many different factors. One thing that I think is important to mention is that affects girls in particular is that in Africa, children tend to go to school very late and often to repeat classes. This is not necessarily a discrimination factor by itself, but as girls progress during education and they're so far behind their education trajectory and they reach age 15 and they're still in primary education, and they're under pressure and through social norms and through the pressure to have children and get married, then inevitably they are the victims. They are the ones who are actually have to leave school early, whereas boys can continue because there are still more expectations for them. So this is a problem that affects Africa in particular. And if only we could make progress in simple measures like ensuring all children start school on time, we would see girls benefiting far, far more.
Yeah, creating more access to education involves bigger societal changes. Girls have also overtaken boys in higher education. Your report found 114 women enrolled for every 100 men. But there are still gaps. Are there still gaps in the topics that we're seeing women study and the types of careers that their studies are leading to? I'm thinking particularly of STEM topics: science, technology, engineering, and math.
And the world is a very varied place. There are so many different manifestations of girls' advantage and disadvantage. You mentioned STEM. It would be very bizarre, but actually some of the countries we tend to associate with more discrimination against girls, like in North Africa or in Western Asia, actually are places where girls are far more likely to be in STEM subjects. And let's stop for a moment and think. Education has become one of the few areas of social and economic life in which girls do have an opportunity to excel, and they focus on that. And they really try very hard to excel through education. It is a different subject, a different issue that they face constraints after school. I think that's something we need to remember. And you're right. In many other parts of the world, we see girls underrepresented in some important areas like science, technology, education, engineering, including in Europe. There are countries like, for instance, Switzerland or Hungary, where girls are really far behind in those subjects.
And the ultimate goal, of course, is gender parity in education. Is there any concern of an imbalance starting to go in the opposite direction, or are we still very, very far from that point?
Yes, I think it is fair to say that there is a concern. Over time, the long-term trajectory is to see more boys being at a disadvantage in the world's, let's say, two-thirds richer countries around the world. And it is usually boys who are already disadvantaged because of poverty and other background social characteristics. So this is a policy concern for many countries in the global north. It is not taking the extreme form that you see perhaps in some of the poorest countries in the world at the expense of girls, but it is a policy concern that needs to be addressed. We cannot forget that, because at the end of the day, it is more or less the same norms that in some parts of the world discriminate against girls. It's the same expectations that end up discriminating against boys in some of the world's richest countries. And we should leave no one behind, regardless of their sex.
Absolutely. It's such an interesting and nuanced report. Thank you so much, Manos Antoninis. That's the director of the UN's Global Education Monitoring Report.